Hello, I'm Dr. James Bogash, expert in health and longevity and creator of Bogash Life and Balance. And today we're going to talk about a particular B vitamin supplement that's very common and I believe potentially overused. And this has to do with folic acid, and in two ways, mainly as a supplement and as folic acid fortification in processed foods that we shouldn't be eating anyway. So you can obviously tell my opinion on that one. But folic acid has a potential dark side, and that has a lot to do with a particular genetic uniqueness called the SNP, in particular the 5-methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase enzyme that requires folic acid. This is one of the reasons why women of childbearing age are told to take a prenatal vitamin, most of which of the prescription ones are junk, but told to take a prenatal vitamin that contains at least 400 milligrams of folic acid to help prevent neural tube defects in women who might have this genetic uniqueness. And since it's pretty common, that seems to make some sense. However, I remember years ago coming across a study on folic acid in colorectal cancer, and they found that people who had there's a big difference between the people who had this genetic uniqueness and were low in folic acid were really at increased risk of colorectal cancer, and the people that didn't have this uniqueness and were taking supplements were actually at increased risk of cancer. Well, that's the big divide there, and it was one of the first signs that I had that maybe folic acid supplementation needed to be done more carefully. So fast forward, 20 years or so, and we have a study here looking at a little over 14,000, so 14,234 people who are already at risk for cardiovascular disease. And they looked at their a couple different things. First of all, the total folate intake. That has to do with supplementation and food fortification. And I also looked at dietary folate equivalent. So basically, how much of this were we getting from foods? We're talking about like crappy processed bread that has folic acid added in it, not green leafies that naturally have folates in them that our body tends to do well with. Well, one of the things they found is that there was a modest intake of dietary. So looking at the total dietary intake of folic acid, there was a reduction in both cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, so dying from anything. So it was protective when part of a good quality diet, and that should be the key there. However, when they looked at people that the folic acid coming from supplements, they found that there was actually a 44% increase in cardiovascular disease and a 28% increase in all-cause mortality. Like, that's significant. And this probably has to do with the fact that folic acid is involved in cell division. This study did not look at the people who had this genetic uniqueness. I would guess that if we looked, we'd find that the people that took too much folic acid and didn't need it had a lot more problems than the people who had this deficiency and took the folic acid. So there's a lot of use of things like methylated forms of folic acid. These are very expensive. I've generally not used them in my practice because there are other ways to approach brain health and cardiovascular disease that don't have the potentially dicey nature of folic acid, as opposed to getting it from a good, well-balanced meal. The only exception would be a good quality multivitamin. Most of those are going to have about 400 milligrams of folic acid in it. Perfectly reasonable and not likely to cause problems. So as always, I'll post a link to this particular study in the description. Make sure you like this video, share it with somebody who you think needs the information, and subscribe to the channel.